It was late on a cool, crisp evening when Officer Dan patrolled the streets of a neighborhood he had learned to fear. His squad car hummed through the darkened streets, the sound of its tires crunching over the cracked pavement cutting through the otherwise silent air. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The city was a patchwork of light and shadow, the street lamps casting long, crooked shadows on buildings worn by time and neglect. To Officer Dan, this part of town was the heart of the problem. A place where crime festered, where people, particularly people of color, seemed to slip through the cracks of society, and where authority was met with resentment, sometimes even violence. He passed a group of black men standing on a corner, their faces a blend of defiance and wariness. They exchanged wary glances as his car slowed, their eyes flicking up to meet his, and then just as quickly, dropping to the ground in silent submission. It was a kind of unspoken understanding. He wore the badge that made him their enforcer. They wore the skin that made them his targets. But as Dan's gaze lingered on one of the men, something about the silence between them unsettled him. For just a brief second, he saw something in their eyes. Resignation, perhaps, or maybe a quiet fury. He didn't know. He only knew that this was the way it was, the way it always had been. As his cruiser rolled on, he saw him. Dr. Alex Williams. The man didn't belong here, or at least, that's how it felt to Officer Dan. Alex Williams was a black man. Sure, but unlike the others around him, he didn't wear the weight of the streets on his shoulders. He walked with the kind of purpose only someone who had truly made something of himself could. Dr. Williams wasn't just any man. He was a respected surgeon at the city's most prestigious hospital. His white coat, though slightly rumpled from the long hours he'd spent in the operating room, marked him as someone who had fought for everything he had. But on this night, as he walked down the sidewalk, heading home from another grueling shift, Dr. Williams didn't look like the kind of person Officer Dan had any respect for. He was too composed, too calm in the face of the world's injustices. And yet, Officer Dan couldn't help but notice how different he seemed compared to the others in the neighborhood. Their eyes met for a fleeting moment, and in that instant, something passed between them. An exchange that neither of them could fully grasp. Dan's expression hardened, the judgment he had spent years perfecting flickering behind his eyes. For Dr. Williams, there was nothing to be done but move past it, to keep walking. He had faced far worse in his life. The city had always been a place of contradictions, and this corner, this moment in time, felt like one of them. The good doctor and the cop, both carrying the weight of the world in their own ways, somehow forced to share a space they never should have. And yet, neither spoke. Neither acknowledged the silent tension between them. Instead, they simply continued on their separate paths, as if nothing had happened at all. Later that night, Dr. Williams would find himself in the familiar, cold fluorescent-lit halls of the hospital. It was a world that had grown comfortable to him over the years, where the fight for respect wasn't between him and those on the street, but between him and the very walls of the institution he worked for. There were whispers behind his back, subtle slights that came in the form of sideways glances or dismissive comments from those who thought a black doctor didn't deserve his position. But Dr. Williams had long since learned to ignore them. He had learned to rise above the sideways looks, the condescending smiles, the polite but hollow words. He was there to save lives. That was all that mattered. But even in the hospital, the distance between him and the world outside was never more than a breath away. That night, as the ER buzzed with activity, a new challenge presented itself, though Dr. Williams would never have guessed it would come in the form of a patient. The doors swung open, and a team of paramedics rushed in, carrying someone on a stretcher. The victim's blood soaked through the bandages that barely kept his injuries contained. Dr. Williams, ever the professional, moved swiftly, only for his hands to freeze as they met the patient's face. It was Officer Dan. A rush of conflicting emotions hit Dr. Williams in an instant. Anger, confusion, disbelief. So many emotions wrapped into one. The man who had glared at him with such disdain only hours ago was now lying unconscious, helpless, in front of him. He was the very person who had spent his career patrolling this very neighborhood. A man who had judged others based solely on the color of their skin, And now, here he was, with no choice but to rely on the very person he had so freely dismissed. Dr. Williams felt his pulse quicken. There was no hesitation, no turning away. This was his job, saving lives, no matter the background or the prejudice that came with it. But as he prepared to operate, a quiet voice inside him wondered, was this the moment when things would change? Could Officer Dan, lying there with a bullet wound and his life in the hands of the very man he had once tried to demean, finally understand the truth about those he had always so readily dismissed? Or would it be just another reminder that no matter how much the world tried to change, people like Dan would always look at men like Dr. Williams and see them as something less than human? For Dan, the pain was sharp, but it wasn't the physical kind that hurt most. It was the vulnerability that came with needing someone. Someone who was not only black, but someone he had learned to hate. In that moment, as Dr. Williams hovered over him, there was no room for his prejudice, no space for the hatred he had spent so many years cultivating. It was just him and the man he had once dismissed as unworthy, now the only one who could save him. The quiet tension between them, between the man who had sworn an oath to protect and the man who had been forced to prove his worth every day of his life, hung in the air. It was an uneasy silence, a moment of reckoning neither of them had anticipated. And as the hospital's lights flickered in the background, the truth of the city's fractured soul felt more apparent than ever. For Dr. Williams, there was no choice but to move forward. He would do what he had trained for, what his duty demanded. But as he stood over Officer Dan, a small but significant question lingered in the back of his mind. Could this be the beginning of something different? Something more than just another night in the operating room? Or would it be just another night where the divide between them remained as deep and unyielding as it had always been? The night air had a bite to it, the chill creeping through the thin fabric of Dr. Williams' coat as he made his way back home from the hospital. His mind was still racing from the events of the day. Surgeries, critical care, and of course, Officer Dan. It wasn't often that someone like Dan ended up in his care. But the night had left an unsettling feeling hanging in the air, like something had shifted, something that neither of them could yet name. Dr. Williams' footsteps echoed in the empty streets as he turned onto his block, the hum of the city alive in the distance. He wasn't looking for trouble, never had been. But trouble had a way of finding him. Or maybe he found it, unknowingly. It wasn't the first time he'd felt like an outsider in a world that was supposed to be his. He had earned his place in the hospital, had worked tirelessly for the respect he deserved. But here, on these streets, the world didn't care about his credentials, his years of sacrifice. All that mattered was the color of his skin. But tonight was different. Tonight, everything felt heavier. The words of his colleagues from earlier in the day echoed in his mind. The casual dismissals, the quiet implications that he was somehow less. He tried to shake it off. It was easy to dismiss the little things when you had to. But tonight, everything was sharper. Every look felt like a weight he couldn't put down. As he neared his building, Dr. Williams couldn't help but glance over at the same corner where he had passed Officer Dan hours earlier. To his surprise, the squad car was still parked there. The engine was running, the light from the street lamp flickering across the car's shiny exterior. Officer Dan was sitting inside, his back slumped against the headrest, eyes staring blankly ahead. He seemed lost in thought, distant, an unexpected vulnerability radiating from him. For a moment, Dr. Williams hesitated. It wasn't as if he wanted to start another confrontation. In fact, part of him wanted to just walk by and ignore the situation. But something in the air, the same unsettling feeling that had followed him all night, pulled him closer. He couldn't just let it go. As Dr. Williams stepped closer to the squad car, Officer Dan's eyes flicked up. The same coldness that had been there before returned. But this time, there was a hint of something else, something not quite so certain. Dr. Williams could feel it, the shift in the tension between them. The usual animosity was still there, but it was quieter, more fragile than before. "Didn't expect to see you here," Dr. Williams said, his voice steady but edged with caution. Dan didn't immediately respond. He just sat there for a moment, his jaw tightening. The two men locked eyes, the silence thick between them, until finally, Dan spoke, his voice low. I didn't ask for your help, you know. Dr. Williams wasn't sure how to respond. The words stung, even though he had expected them. This man, this cop who had looked down on him for years, had just been in his care, had literally relied on him to survive. And yet here he was, dismissing him again as if nothing had changed. I didn't ask for it either, Dr. Williams replied, his voice even but carrying a weight of its own. But I did what I had to do. Dan didn't meet his gaze this time. His hands gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, as if trying to keep control of something that was slipping away from him. Dr. Williams couldn't help but notice the tension in his shoulders, the exhaustion in his eyes. For a moment, he almost felt sorry for the man. I don't need your pity, Dan muttered. But it was softer now, less certain. I can handle it. Then why are you still sitting here? Dr. Williams asked, his words quiet but direct. He wasn't sure where they came from. Maybe it was the frustration of a lifetime of injustice. Maybe it was the understanding that, despite everything, this man, this cop, was still a part of the same broken system that had made them both the way they were. Dan looked at him again, this time with something more vulnerable in his eyes. I don't know what the hell I'm supposed to do anymore. There was a silence that hung in the air, a fragile, raw kind of honesty between them. Dr. Williams wasn't sure what to make of it. The cop, the one who had looked down on him, the one who had walked through life with a badge and a sense of power, was now asking him, of all people, for something he couldn't quite articulate. You could start by realizing that I'm not the enemy, Dr. Williams said, his tone firm but not unkind. You're fighting the wrong battle. Dan didn't respond right away. His fingers twitched on the steering wheel, and for a long moment, the only sound between them was the hum of the engine. When Dan finally spoke, his voice was almost inaudible. Maybe I'm the one who's been wrong all along. Dr. Williams didn't know what to say to that. He didn't know if it was true or just the wariness of a man who had been carrying too much for too long. But for the first time, he saw something in Officer Dan, a crack in the armor, a moment of self-doubt. You can't change everything overnight, Dr. Williams said quietly, almost as if speaking to himself. But you can start somewhere. Dan didn't argue. Instead, he simply nodded, his gaze focused on something beyond the windshield, lost in thought. For a moment, Dr. Williams stood there, unsure if they had made any real progress. But as he turned to walk away, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between them. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was there. The world was still divided, still full of hatred and misunderstanding. But maybe, just maybe, there was room for change. A glimmer of it, anyway. Dr. Williams went home that night, the city quiet and cold around him, but the weight of his own thoughts pressing harder than ever. What would it take for someone like Officer Dan to truly change? Was it even possible? Or was this just another fleeting moment of doubt that would fade as quickly as it had appeared? The questions lingered in the air as he lay in bed, but the answer would only come in time. And as for Officer Dan, well, he sat in his patrol car a little longer, still trying to figure out who he was, what he had become, and what he was willing to do next. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure if it was one he could walk alone. The days following the encounter between Dr. Williams and Officer Dan felt both like a lifetime and just a fleeting moment. The city continued to pulse with its usual rhythm of violence, injustice, and exhaustion. But there was something in the air now, something unspoken. Dr. Williams couldn't shake the feeling that the moment they'd shared, however brief, had planted a seed, though he wasn't sure yet if it would grow into something meaningful. He had seen so many people in his life who'd been set in their ways, people who lived their lives shaped by prejudice and fear. He didn't have the luxury of hoping that one conversation would change everything, even if it had felt different. As for Officer Dan, he couldn't seem to shake the image of Dr. Williams standing there, eyes steady and voice calm in the midst of his own confusion. He had heard those words echoing in his mind every night since their conversation. You're fighting the wrong battle. He had always thought of people like Dr. Williams as nothing more than a cog in the system. A person who had come up from nothing, sure, but who still had his place, his niche in the world. Now, it seemed more complicated. Maybe he wasn't the one who had all the answers. Maybe he was the one who needed to start questioning everything. The next time their worlds collided, it would be in the very space where their struggles intersected, the streets. The divide between them was still palpable, even if it was less certain, less venomous. Officer Dan was back on patrol, feeling the weight of his badge and the history it carried more than he ever had before. One evening, as the sun dipped beneath the horizon, casting long shadows over the cracked streets, Officer Dan found himself on the same block again. This was a part of the city that he knew too well, the part he had spent years trying to control, but never truly understanding. He turned the corner, the sound of his tires rolling over the uneven pavement familiar in the quiet of the night. He pulled up to the curb, scanning the sidewalk ahead. There were groups of people walking, heads down, eyes cast upward only when absolutely necessary. This was the world he had sworn to patrol, but tonight, it felt different. Dr. Williams had been working another grueling shift at the hospital, trying to save lives in a system that felt increasingly hostile to people who looked like him. Despite his success, he had never fully escaped the looming threat of violence, the suspicion that colored every encounter he had with the world outside the hospital walls. Tonight, he was just walking home, the cool air biting at his skin, his steps quick but measured. He had learned long ago how to navigate these streets, how to move without drawing attention, how to avoid the sharp stares of people who assumed the worst of him. As Dr. Williams walked, he didn't expect to see Dan's patrol car again. He wasn't even sure why he still cared. After all, there was nothing that could change between them. But when he saw the headlights cutting through the darkness, he knew it was him again. Officer Dan. There was no avoiding it this time. They were on the same road, literally and figuratively. As Dr. Williams drew closer, he could feel the weight of the moment. It was one of those rare, charged encounters where everything felt like it was hanging in the balance. Dan's eyes flicked up when he saw him approaching. His expression was unreadable, a mixture of wariness and fatigue. But something about the way he held himself seemed different, less defensive. Dr. Williams could see it in the way Dan's shoulders were slightly slumped, the way his jaw was clenched, as if he was struggling with something far bigger than the anger that usually clouded his judgment. Dr. Williams approached the car slowly, feeling the odd tension between them swell, but it wasn't the same. He wasn't angry, not anymore. He wasn't sure if it was pity or something else, but there was an undeniable curiosity now. He stopped just in front of Dan's squad car, allowing the two of them to stand there in the fragile silence. "You've been here a while," Dr. Williams said, his voice calm but steady. Dan glanced at the dashboard clock. "Just keeping watch," he muttered. His voice was rougher than usual, betraying a sense of fatigue. "You know how it is." Dr. Williams didn't respond immediately. He had the urge to ask about the long hours, the impossible nature of the work, but instead, he let the question hang in the air, a question neither of them was ready to answer. "I was thinking about what you said," Dan finally spoke, his voice hesitant, as though the words themselves were foreign to him, "about fighting the wrong battle." Dr. Williams studied him carefully. He hadn't expected Dan to actually reflect on their earlier conversation. And yet, here they were, with Dan questioning himself, questioning the very framework that had defined his entire existence. It was a vulnerable moment, rare for someone like Dan, and Dr. Williams didn't take it lightly. "It's not just about the badge, is it?" Dr. Williams replied softly, his eyes never leaving Dan's. "You wear it because you've been told that it gives you power, that it makes you the one in control. But the truth is, it doesn't. Not really. It only gives you a position. Power is something else." Dan shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his fingers tapping nervously against the steering wheel. The words stung, but he knew there was truth in them. There was always something deeper behind the uniform, something beneath the anger and the hostility that had been drilled into him since his first day on the job. "You think you have all the answers, don't you?" Dan muttered, almost to himself, but Dr. Williams heard it. There was no malice in his words, only exhaustion. "I'm not saying I do," Dr. Williams answered, his voice tinged with something more vulnerable. "But I know the system. I live it every day. And I know the way it shapes us, how we carry it, even when we don't realize it. We can't change anything unless we start by understanding that. Dan didn't reply right away. He just looked ahead, his eyes distant. Dr. Williams wasn't sure if he had made a breakthrough or just deepened the divide. But this was something neither of them could ignore. It wasn't just about their jobs anymore. It was about what it meant to be human in a city divided by so many invisible lines. Then, as if on cue, the sounds of the streets began to rise. Voices from a nearby corner, the distant rumble of an argument, the buzz of a radio crackling somewhere in the distance. It reminded them both of what they were up against. "I should go," Dr. Williams said, his voice carrying a mix of finality and uncertainty. "Yeah," Dan replied, almost absently. His eyes followed Dr. Williams for a moment, and there was something unspoken between them. Something both heavier and lighter than the world they had just stepped away from. Dr. Williams nodded and walked away, his steps quick and sure, but as he moved down the street, he couldn't help but glance back once more. Officer Dan was still sitting in his patrol car, but this time, the divide between them didn't feel quite so insurmountable. It was still there, of course, a gulf between their lives that couldn't be bridged with a single conversation. But the seed had been planted. They had crossed paths once more, and now, there was no telling what kind of change might be waiting just around the corner. As Dr. Williams disappeared into the darkness, Dan sat there in his car, a man lost in the weight of his own thoughts. Something had shifted in him. He couldn't explain it, couldn't quite understand it, but there was a strange kind of openness in the air. And for the first time in a long while, he wasn't sure where he was supposed to go next. The days following that quiet exchange between Dr. Williams and Officer Dan lingered in both of their minds like an unspoken promise. Neither man truly knew how to navigate the uncharted waters between them, but they were both aware that something had shifted. For Dr. Williams, it wasn't a moment of triumph. He had dealt with so much in his life that a single conversation couldn't undo the weight of years of racial prejudice. But it was a moment, and sometimes moments mattered more than anything. Officer Dan, too, was struggling with what had happened. He had never imagined that a simple conversation could change his perception, but the world had a funny way of turning your expectations upside down. As he sat in his patrol car or patrolled the streets at night, he couldn't stop thinking about Dr. Williams, about the calm in his eyes, the quiet authority in his voice, and the truth he had spoken that struck deeper than any words he had ever heard before. The weight of his badge, the promises he had made, all felt so different now. He wasn't sure how to reconcile his newfound doubts with the system he had been a part of for so long. But neither of them could have predicted that the path they were on would soon intersect once again in a way that neither could have foreseen. It would come quickly, too quickly. The night was bitterly cold, and the hospital hummed with its usual mix of exhaustion and urgency. Dr. Williams had been on shift for hours, his mind a blur of names, faces, and lives that hung in the balance. The emergency room was always a battleground, but tonight felt different. The tension in the air seemed thicker, heavier, and Dr. Williams couldn't quite place why. At that moment, the doors to the ER burst open. Paramedics rushed in, their faces drawn and grim. They wheeled a young man in, bleeding from multiple gunshot wounds, his body limp, his pulse weak. Dr. Williams moved swiftly, instinct taking over. It was what he did. He saved lives. His eyes scanned the gurney, assessing the damage, and his hands moved quickly to prepare for the next steps. But as the paramedics peeled back the blanket covering the man's body, Dr. Williams froze. The man on the gurney wasn't just any patient. It was Officer Dan. The realization hit him like a hammer. The same officer who had walked the streets with suspicion and disdain toward him. The same man who had begrudgingly allowed Dr. Williams to operate on him after their last encounter, was now in front of him again. This time, not as a passive participant, but as a man on the verge of death. The bullet wounds, deep and jagged, left little room for error. Dr. Williams' heart raced, but his face remained calm. This was his job. No matter the history, no matter the tension. They were both human in this moment. Get him into surgery now. Dr. Williams barked, pushing through his own surprise. His hands were steady as he took charge, giving orders to the nurses and paramedics around him. He couldn't afford hesitation. Lives were at stake. The chaos of the operating room was deafening, but Dr. Williams was in his element. His hands moved with the practiced ease of someone who had spent years perfecting his craft. He didn't need to think about it. It was instinct now. But as he worked, his mind couldn't help but flash back to the last time he had seen Officer Dan. That quiet moment on the street, when Dan had, for the briefest second, looked at him as if he wasn't the enemy. But now, with Dan's life hanging in the balance, those questions about the man's humanity, about his ability to change, all seemed irrelevant. In this moment, there was no space for anything other than survival. The hours dragged on, but Dr. Williams' focus never wavered. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the surgery was over. Officer Dan was stable, but only just. The next few hours would tell whether he would survive. Dr. Williams stepped away from the operating table, his body weary but his mind still spinning with thoughts that he hadn't fully processed. He had saved him, but what did that mean? Could he ever truly forgive someone who had spent his life reinforcing the very systems that had made people like Dr. Williams invisible, less than? As Dr. Williams scrubbed his hands in the sink, a nurse approached him, her face tight with concern. "Dr. Williams," she said, her voice soft, "you should see this." She handed him a piece of paper, a report from the police department, detailing the circumstances surrounding Officer Dan's injuries. He had been involved in a raid gone wrong, a violent confrontation that had escalated quickly, leaving him wounded and barely hanging on. But the most shocking part of the report wasn't the injuries. It was the fact that Officer Dan had been with another officer at the time, an officer who had made racist comments about the very community they had been sent to raid. Dr. Williams' heart sank as he read the words. It was the same toxic culture he had always known, the same hatred that had been woven into the very fabric of law enforcement. Officer Dan, for all his confusion and vulnerability in their previous encounter, was still part of that system. He was still tied to the very thing that had shaped his hatred. But Dr. Williams knew he had to separate the man in front of him, the man who was now fighting for his life, from the man who had enforced a system that had hurt so many. His job was to heal, and no matter how hard it was to reconcile, he couldn't let the man's past dictate his future. Not here, not now. As the night wore on, Dr. Williams found himself standing at Officer Dan's bedside. The room was quiet, save for the soft beeping of the machines that kept Dan alive. His face was pale, his body bruised and battered, but there was something fragile about him now, something human that Dr. Williams hadn't seen before. He stood there for a long time, just watching, before he finally spoke. "You don't get to hide from the truth anymore, Dan," Dr. Williams said quietly, his voice low and steady. "Not from yourself, not from anyone." Dan's eyes fluttered open, his lips parting in an attempt to speak, but no words came out. He tried again, his voice hoarse. "I'm sorry," he rasped. "I never." Dr. Williams held up a hand to stop him, his expression softening. "I know," he said, more gently now. "But words won't fix this. You have to make a choice. You can keep living the way you have, or you can change. But that's something only you can do. No one else can do it for you." Dan's eyes filled with a mixture of pain and confusion. He was trapped in a cycle of his own making. But now, for the first time, he was faced with a choice that went beyond survival. It was about redemption, about confronting the damage he had done. Not just to the people around him, but to himself. "I don't know how to change," he whispered, his voice weak but filled with a sense of desperation. "I don't even know where to start." Dr. Williams stood there, his gaze unwavering. "It starts with understanding. It starts with listening to the people you've wronged. It starts with acknowledging the pain you've caused, even if it's hard to look at." For a long time, neither of them spoke. The weight of their words hung in the air, a heavy silence settling between them. Officer Dan's path to change would be long and difficult, but for the first time, he was willing to face it. And for Dr. Williams, this moment was not about forgiveness. It wasn't about forgetting what had happened. It was about giving Officer Dan the opportunity to see a different world. A world where he wasn't just the badge he wore, but the man he could become. The days following Officer Dan's surgery were a blur of activity for Dr. Williams. The hospital, as always, was a revolving door of crisis, but something inside him had shifted. Despite his reservations about Officer Dan, despite the overwhelming weight of systemic prejudice and violence, he felt a strange sense of responsibility now. A responsibility not just as a doctor, but as a person who had been given the rare chance to make a difference. This feeling lingered, but it was tempered by the exhaustion and frustration that filled his daily life. The racial tensions that still haunted him, both in his work and on the streets, were hard to escape, no matter how much effort he put into being just a doctor. Meanwhile, Officer Dan lay in his hospital bed, his body battered but healing. But it wasn't just his physical wounds that he was grappling with. The emotional toll was much heavier. For the first time in his life, he felt the weight of the badge he had worn so blindly, the lives he had ruined with his actions, and the people he had harmed, especially Dr. Williams. He was trapped in the quiet of his own mind, forced to confront the reality of who he had been and, more importantly, who he could still become. He wasn't sure how to make amends, how to begin the slow, painful process of change, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't keep living the way he had been. The truth, so often buried under layers of denial, was now staring him in the face. The moment of reckoning for both men came unexpectedly, as the violence that had plagued the city found its way into their lives once again. It was late on a Friday afternoon when Dr. Williams received the call. The ER was already full, a chaotic whirlwind of patients and procedures, but this call was different. The shooting, just a few blocks away from the hospital, had left multiple victims injured, including a pregnant woman. Dr. Williams didn't hesitate. He grabbed his gloves, called for an assistant, and prepared to go to work. What he didn't expect was that Officer Dan, despite his injuries, would be at the scene of the shooting. The police had been involved in a raid that had gone horribly wrong. As usual, the situation had escalated far beyond what anyone had anticipated. The pregnant woman had been caught in the crossfire of a misguided attempt to apprehend a suspect. Her life, and the life of her unborn child, hung in the balance. But when Dr. Williams arrived on the scene, ready to work his usual brand of medical magic, he found Dan there as well. "Dan, what the hell are you doing here?" Dr. Williams demanded, his voice sharp but laced with concern as he rushed to the woman's side. Dan, still struggling to keep his composure, looked up at Dr. Williams with an unreadable expression. He was holding his side, his uniform stained with blood, but it wasn't his own. I'm here because I have to be. She needs help." Dr. Williams barely glanced at him before turning his attention to the woman. "We don't have time for this, Dan. Get out of the way." But Dan didn't move. Instead, he took a hesitant step toward Dr. Williams, his face suddenly looking as exhausted as it was remorseful. "I never meant for any of this to happen, Williams. I've spent years doing things I never even thought about, things I should have questioned. But now, I don't know how to fix it." Dr. Williams, his hands still steady as he worked, felt a flicker of something. Was it guilt? Or just the recognition that, in that moment, something had changed in Dan? He couldn't tell. His instincts were still to save the life in front of him, to block out the noise and do what he knew best. But there was something deeper at work here. "You can't fix it in one day, Dan. You can't undo years of harm with words alone," Dr. Williams said, his tone flat but not unkind. "But this," he gestured to the woman and her unborn child, barely clinging to life. "This is where it starts. You want to make things right? Then help." Dan, his face grim, nodded. His own training kicked in, and despite the pain in his side, he moved swiftly to assist Dr. Williams. He held the woman's hand, trying to reassure her as best he could while the medical team worked in tandem, keeping her stable. For once, he wasn't thinking about the badge, about the color of his skin, about the power he had. He was just a man trying to do the right thing, even if it was the smallest of steps. As Dr. Williams worked, he found himself glancing at Dan more and more. For the first time, he wasn't seeing a cop, a man who had blindly enforced a broken system. He was seeing a human being, a man struggling to redeem himself, just like everyone else. Dr. Williams couldn't forgive everything that had come before, and he wasn't sure if he ever could. But in this moment, Watching Dan put his life on the line to help save someone else, he saw something new, a glimpse of humanity where there had once only been division. The woman, after what felt like hours, was finally stable enough to be transported to the ICU. Dr. Williams stood by her bedside for a moment, checking her vitals one last time. It had been a successful save, but it had come at a cost. The emotional toll on both the medical team and Officer Dan was palpable. As they made their way to the parking lot after the scene had settled down, Dr. Williams looked at Dan. There was no animosity between them now, just exhaustion. Like two men who had lived through something together. "You did good back there," Dr. Williams said quietly. "But that's not enough." Dan looked down, his eyes heavy. I know that. I don't know what's next, but I can't keep going down this path. I've hurt too many people. And I've done it with no understanding of the consequences." Dr. Williams studied him for a moment, his expression unreadable. "Understanding comes with action, Dan. You can't just apologize for things you've done. You need to show that you're willing to make it right. And it's going to take time. A long time." Dan nodded, though his face was marked by a combination of relief and guilt. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I want to do better. I need to." For a long moment, neither man spoke. The city around them hummed with the usual noise of life, of people caught in their struggles, their lives intersecting in ways they couldn't always understand. And yet, in that small moment between them, it felt like something had changed. Not everything, not all at once, but there was hope now. Real, tangible hope. "I'll help you," Dr. Williams said finally, his voice firm. "But it's not going to be easy. The world won't just forgive you. You have to prove it every day. And that starts now." In the days that followed, Dr. Williams and Officer Dan found themselves working together more than either of them expected. It wasn't easy. There were still the remnants of suspicion from both sides. Dr. Williams, wary of the system that had caused so much pain, and Dan, unsure of how to reconcile his past actions with his present intent. But they began to understand one another in ways they hadn't before. Dan started to reach out to the community in ways he had never imagined. He volunteered to speak at local schools, at community events, explaining the need for change within law enforcement, acknowledging his own failures, and seeking understanding. He worked with Dr. Williams to improve relations between the police force and the communities they had been charged with protecting, slowly trying to dismantle the prejudices he had once held so tightly. It wasn't a perfect solution. There were setbacks. There were moments of doubt, moments when the walls between them seemed just as high as before. But the cracks that had appeared, the brief moments of humanity they had shared, began to widen. It was hard, it was messy, and it was far from over. But it was a start that neither of them could ignore. The weeks that followed were a mix of frustration and small victories. Dr. Williams had never been one to expect easy solutions or quick fixes, especially when it came to the deep-seated racial tensions in the city. But after the night in the ER when he had worked alongside Officer Dan, something within him had shifted. He could no longer deny the complexity of their situation. How the system they both navigated was broken, and yet how both of them had somehow become a part of it. Despite everything, there was a glimmer of change in Officer Dan. A quiet resolve that made Dr. Williams question whether this time, it might actually be possible to do something about it. Meanwhile, Officer Dan had been trying to keep his promise to himself. He knew his journey wasn't going to be easy, but he was determined to make it right. He had begun attending community meetings, something that had once felt like a betrayal of the very world he had built his identity around. He spoke openly about his mistakes, about the pain he had caused, even though the words felt foreign on his tongue. He wasn't there for sympathy. He wasn't there to redeem himself in the eyes of others. He was there because he knew that true change didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened when people started listening. But the city was still a battleground, with the wounds of past injustices far from healed. The animosity between law enforcement and the Black community was as prevalent as ever. The distrust had become so ingrained that it seemed impossible to untangle. Every time Dan tried to take a step forward, he was met with skepticism. The faces he saw at those meetings, the ones who had long been subjected to violence and prejudice at the hands of people like him, weren't ready to forgive. They weren't ready to forget. It was during one of these tense meetings, where the air seemed thick with hostility, that the two men found themselves face to face once again. The community center was packed that evening. Dr. Williams had been invited to speak on a panel about healthcare inequality and the importance of equitable treatment for all people, no matter their race. As much as he wanted to refuse the invitation, to take a break from the relentless cycle of activism, he knew that his voice was needed. He had spent years advocating for those who couldn't fight for themselves, and this moment felt no different. As he entered the community room, he was met with the usual mix of smiles and suspicion. Some of the people in the room knew him by reputation. His name had become synonymous with both excellence and resistance. But there were still plenty who saw him as just another doctor, another member of the system they were constantly at odds with. Among the crowd, Dan was already seated, his uniform stiff, his face a mixture of determination and unease. He had been invited to speak as well, and though the weight of the moment pressed down on him, he was ready. The fact that people were willing to let him speak felt like both a blessing and a curse. He was stepping into a world he had tried so hard to ignore, one that demanded answers, accountability, and change. Dr. Williams saw him sitting there, and for a moment, their eyes locked across the room. It wasn't the same animosity as before, but there was still something uncertain between them, an unspoken acknowledgement of just how complicated their situation had become. There was a quiet tension in the room as people noticed them both in the same space, on the same panel. It wasn't long before the moderator called the meeting to order, and the discussion began. Dr. Williams spoke first, passionately addressing the deep-seated inequalities in the healthcare system, the disparities that existed not just in access to care, but in the treatment that Black people, in particular, received from medical professionals. He spoke from the heart, using his own experiences as both a doctor and a Black man in a field that had been built on centuries of exclusion. His words rang with truth and urgency, and as he spoke, the crowd seemed to hang on every word. Then, it was Dan's turn. He stood, his body stiff and his uniform too tight, but he was resolute. He cleared his throat before he began to speak. "I know that a lot of people here don't trust me," he started, his voice thick with the weight of the truth he was about to lay bare. "I've been a part of a system that has hurt you. I've enforced laws that have been used to oppress you, to silence you, to treat you as less than human. I've watched people like you suffer while I did nothing." The room was quiet, save for the occasional cough or shifting of feet. There was no applause, no nods of agreement, only silence. Dan could feel the eyes on him, the resentment that still simmered beneath the surface. He didn't flinch. He had come here to say what needed to be said, to acknowledge his part in the harm that had been done. "I'm not here to ask for forgiveness," he continued. "I don't deserve it. But I'm here because I know that the system needs to change. I'm here because I want to help make that happen. I know it's going to take time, and I know it's not going to be easy, but I'm committed to doing the work." Dr. Williams, who had been listening intently, felt the weight of Dan's words settle into his chest. This wasn't just a man who had come to apologize for his past mistakes. This was a man who was trying to do the hardest thing he could: change. Dr. Williams had seen so many people in his life speak the right words without any real understanding of the responsibility they carried. But Dan was different. This was someone who had lived with the consequences of his actions and was determined to make amends. For the first time in a long while, Dr. Williams felt the flicker of something that he hadn't dared to hope for: trust. As the meeting continued, the conversation grew heated. Many in the crowd were still deeply skeptical of Officer Dan. They asked him difficult questions, confronting him with their own experiences, their own pain. Some spoke of their own children, of their brothers and sisters who had been brutalized by the very system Dan had served. Others told stories of lost opportunities, broken families, and ruined lives that had been left in the wake of unchecked power. But despite the hostility, Dan didn't back down. He answered every question as honestly as he could, even when the words were painful to hear. He acknowledged his past, but he also pointed to the future. "I can't change what I've done, but I can make sure that I do better moving forward," he said, his voice steady but quiet. "And I will." Dr. Williams watched from his seat, a quiet respect growing within him. He knew it wasn't enough to heal the years of hurt, but he had come to understand something profound that night. Change was possible, even in the most unlikely of places. And sometimes, the first step was simply showing up and admitting the truth. The meeting ended late into the night, with no clear resolution, but there was a shift. Dr. Williams and Officer Dan found themselves speaking to a few people afterward, some of them offering cautious words of support, others still angry and unresolved. But the important thing was that the conversation had started. It wasn't a quick fix, but the first real step had been taken. As they walked out of the community center together, there was a quiet acknowledgement between the two men. They weren't allies just yet, but they were closer than they had ever been before. "I didn't think you'd be able to speak like that," Dr. Williams said quietly, his eyes scanning the dark streets ahead. "You were raw. Honest." Dan nodded, his face serious, but not without a hint of something like relief. "I had to be. I couldn't keep pretending. I don't know what's next, but I know it starts with me owning up to what I've done. And that's where I'll begin." As they walked side by side, the night felt a little less heavy, the weight of the world a little less pressing. There was still so much to do, so much to fix, but for the first time, both men had taken a step toward understanding each other. The road ahead would be long, but it was one they could walk together. For the first time, there was a sense of hope, not just in what could happen, but in what was already beginning to unfold.